Sometimes the most innocent creatures pay the price for man's greed. In the mountains of Arizona Territory, 3 helpless mountain lion cubs cry out from behind cold metal bars, their mother nowhere to be found. Hunters captured them to sell to traveling shows back east, but they picked the wrong territory. Tashunka, an Apache warrior, finds the cubs before the sun sets. His weathered hand reaches toward the cage as he looks into their frightened eyes. The hunters will return tonight, expecting easy money. Instead, they'll find a man who has spent his life protecting what others destroy. This warrior survived cavalry charges and the long march to the reservation. But what drives a man to risk everything for 3 wild cats? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and juniper through the narrow canyon where Tashunka made his home. His dwelling sat modest and weathered against the red rock wall, built from stones he had gathered himself over many seasons. At 62, his hands bore the marks of both war and peace scars from cavalry sabers crossed with calluses from honest work with wood and leather. Dawn each morning began the same way. Before dawn touched the peaks, he would step outside and offer tobacco to the 4 directions, speaking words his grandfather had taught him when the world was different. The Apache way lived in these moments, in the careful attention to what the land provided and what it asked in return. His sacred medicine pouch hung at his side, worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside lay items passed down through generations. A piece of turquoise from the sacred mountains, dried herbs gathered under specific moon phases, and a small carved bear that had belonged to his grandfather's grandfather. These objects connected him to something larger than the boundaries drawn by treaty makers and reservation agents. The pouch reminded him daily of his obligations. Apache tradition taught that all life moved in circles, connected by invisible threads. To harm one creature brought imbalance that rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. To protect the innocent, especially those who could not protect themselves, was not just honor but necessity. Tashunka had learned this lesson through blood and loss. During his years as a young warrior, he had fought alongside Geronimo against the encroaching settlements. He had seen his people's children torn from their families and sent to distant schools to have their Apache hearts cut away. He had watched cavalry soldiers burn sacred places and scatter the bones of ancestors. But he had also served as a scout for those same cavalry units, earning respect through skill and courage, even from men who would never see him as equal. There, contradiction lived in his chest like a permanent ache, knowing that survival sometimes meant serving those who brought destruction to everything you held sacred. After the surrender, after the long walk to the reservation, he had chosen a different path. While other warriors drank away their grief or raged against the impossible boundaries of their new lives, Tashunka retreated to this canyon. Here, at least, he could live according to the old ways. Here, he could remember what it meant to be Apache. The reservation agent, Patterson, visited monthly to ensure compliance with government regulations. Patterson was not cruel, merely ignorant of the weight his presence carried. He would count heads, distribute commodities, and file reports that reduced proud people to numbers on federal documents. "You live too far out here, Tashunka," Patterson often said. "Come closer to the agency. There's work building fences, or you could help with the cattle program." But Tashunka understood what Patterson could not, that some things were worth more than convenience or comfort. In this canyon, he could still track the old animal paths. He could still read weather patterns in cloud formations his ancestors had named. He could still hear the voices of the land speaking in languages older than any human tongue. His daily routine connected him to this larger conversation. After morning prayers, he would check his small garden where he grew corn, beans, and squash. In the traditional way, the 3 sisters, Apache women called them, because they grew best when planted together. The corn provided support for the bean vines, while the beans fed nitrogen to the soil, and the squash leaves shaded the ground. To hold moisture, mid-morning brought hunting or gathering, depending on the season and what the land offered. Tashunka took only what he needed, always leaving something behind: tobacco, corn pollen, or prayers of gratitude. This was not superstition, but practical wisdom learned over countless generations. Take too much, and the balance breaks. Take with gratitude, and the land continues to provide. In afternoon hours, he worked with his hands repairing tools, crafting items to trade at the agency store, or maintaining his modest dwelling. His fingers remembered skills passed down from master craftsmen: how to work leather until it became supple as skin, how to balance an arrow shaft for true flight, how to weave baskets so tightly they could hold water. These skills connected him to something the reservation system sought to destroy: the knowledge that made Apache people who they were. Every properly fletched arrow carried forward the wisdom of countless ancestors. Every medicine pouch stitched with proper prayers held power that no government document could touch. Evenings belonged to reflection and preparation. Tashunka would sit outside his dwelling as shadows lengthened, watching how light played across the canyon walls. Sometimes he would see deer emerging from hidden places to drink at the small spring that bubbled from the rocks. Occasionally, a fox would appear, bold enough to hunt mice near his dwelling. Ravens often perched on nearby ledges, their intelligent eyes seeming to study him with approval. Mountain lions also lived in these canyons, though they rarely showed themselves. Tashunka had found their tracks near the spring, and once he had glimpsed a female with cubs moving like a liquid shadow through the juniper. Apache people understood mountain lions as powerful spirits, creatures that walked between worlds, equally at home in physical reality and the realm of dreams. The big cats represented qualities Apache warriors aspired to embody: patience, stealth, fierce protection of family, and the wisdom to avoid unnecessary conflicts while remaining absolutely deadly when cornered. Children learned from infancy that mountain lions demanded respect, not fear. They were teachers as much as predators. This understanding made what Tashunka discovered that October afternoon so deeply troubling. He had been following deer sign along a familiar trail when he heard the sound, a low, distressed calling that made his skin prickle with recognition and alarm. The metal cage sat in a small clearing where hunters had made temporary camp. 3 mountain lion cubs, perhaps 3 months old, huddled together behind iron bars. Their golden eyes reflected terror and confusion as they cried for their mother. Around the cage lay evidence of human presence: boot prints, cigarette butts, empty whiskey bottles, and the scattered remains of a hasty meal. But it was what he did not see that filled Tashunka with cold rage. No mother lion prowled nearby. No protective parent paced restlessly just beyond human sight. The cubs were alone, abandoned to whatever fate their captors had planned. Tashunka knelt beside the cage, his weathered hand reaching toward the bars. The cubs shrank back initially, but something in his stillness seemed to calm them. The largest of the 3, a male with distinctive black markings around his eyes, stopped crying and studied this new human with cautious intelligence. "Where is your mother, little ones?" Tashunka whispered in Apache, his voice carrying the tone elders used when speaking to frightened children. "What evil has taken her from you?" The cubs could not answer, but their condition told the story. They were thin from lack of milk, their fur dull from stress and confinement. They had been separated from their mother for at least 2 days, possibly longer. Without intervention, they would weaken and die in this metal prison. Apache tradition was clear about such situations. All life connected through invisible threads. To ignore suffering within your power to prevent was to damage your own spirit. To abandon helpless creatures was to invite similar abandonment when your own time of need arrived. But tradition also taught careful consideration before action. These cubs belonged to someone now, at least in the white man's understanding of ownership. Taking them would be theft according to territorial law. Interfering with legal commerce could bring serious consequences: imprisonment, exile from the reservation, or worse. Tashunka touched his medicine pouch and felt the weight of ancestral guidance. His grandfather had taught him that some choices transcended human law. When faced with cruelty to the innocent, a true warrior did not calculate personal cost. He acted according to deeper obligations. The cub sensed his internal struggle and pressed closer to the bars. The largest male reached out a tiny paw, barely touching Tashunka's finger through the metal. That contact sent electricity through the old warrior's body. Recognition, passing between kindred spirits, in that moment. Tashunka understood why the spirits had guided him to this place. These cubs were not random victims of human greed. They were a test, a measure of whether he still carried the true heart of an Apache warrior. Everything he claimed to believe, all the traditions he sought to preserve, meant nothing if he walked away from this clearing. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Tashunka made his choice. He would not abandon these helpless creatures to whatever cruel fate awaited them. The path ahead remained unclear, but his first step was certain. He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small piece of dried meat. Breaking it into tiny portions, he offered the food through the cage bars. The cubs sniffed cautiously before beginning to eat, their trust in him growing with each morsel accepted. "I do not know how yet, little ones," he said softly, "but I will keep you safe. This I promise before all the spirits of my ancestors. Whatever comes, you will not face it alone." The hunters would return eventually, probably after dark when the cooling air made travel more comfortable. When they did, they would find an Apache warrior who had spent 6 decades learning how to protect what mattered most. They would discover that some bonds could not be broken by cages, and some promises carried the weight of generations. Tashunka settled beside the cage to wait, his hand resting on the worn grip of the knife that had saved his life in more battles than he cared to. Remember, the cubs pressed against the bars nearest to him, drawing comfort from his presence. Together, they watched the sun paint the canyon walls with fire, and prepared for whatever darkness would bring. The morning light revealed what Tashunka had hoped never to see. 20 yards from the cage, hidden by a fallen log and scattered rocks, lay the body of the cub's mother. She had been shot multiple times, her magnificent golden coat now matted with dried blood. The wounds spoke of cruel marksmanship, shots placed to disable rather than kill quickly, suggesting the hunters had enjoyed her suffering. A large blood-stained rock lay near her head, the stone that had delivered the final blow. Tashunka knelt beside the fallen cat, his weathered fingers gently touching her still flank. She had been in her prime, perhaps 6 years old, strong enough to feed and protect her young through another harsh winter. Now she was carrion, left to rot while her children cried themselves to death in their metal prison. The tracks around her body told the complete story. She had approached the hunter's camp, probably drawn by the sound of her cubs crying. Instead of fleeing at the sight of armed men, maternal instinct had driven her forward. The hunters had been waiting, their rifles ready for exactly this moment. They had wounded her first, shots to her hindquarters that prevented escape but left her conscious and aware. Then they had taken their time, enjoying their power over one of the mountain's most feared predators. The blood-stained rock suggested they had finished her with deliberate brutality. Wanting to feel the impact of stone against skull, Tashunka's jaw tightened as he read the sign. 4 sets of boot prints surrounded the kill site. They had all participated, all shared in the cruel sport of torturing a creature whose only crime was trying to save her children. The largest prints, probably their leader, showed scuff marks where he had kicked the dying cat adding humiliation to her agony. "Forgive me, mother," Tashunka whispered in Apache, his voice thick with rage and sorrow. "I came too late to save you. But your little ones will not share your fate. This I swear on the bones of my grandfathers." He performed what purification he could without proper ceremony, sprinkling corn pollen over her body and offering tobacco to carry her spirit to the hunting grounds beyond. The cubs needed his attention, but this warrior mother deserved recognition of her courage and sacrifice. Returning to the cage, Tashunka found the cubs huddled together in the corner farthest from where their mother had died. They seemed to sense what lay beyond their sight, their small bodies trembling with grief and fear. The largest male, the one who had reached toward Tashunka, now refused to approach the bars. "She fought for you," Tashunka told him softly. "She died trying to bring you home. A warrior's death, worthy of honor and remembrance." The cubs' condition had worsened overnight. Without their mother's milk, they were weakening rapidly. Their eyes had lost the bright alertness of healthy young predators, replaced by the dull stare of creatures approaching death. If the hunters planned to sell them alive, they needed to act quickly. This urgency changed Tashunka's calculations. He had hoped for time to plan carefully, to find some way of resolving the situation without bloodshed. But the cubs could not wait for elegant solutions. They needed rescue immediately, regardless of consequences. Tashunka began his investigation of the hunters' full operation. Following their tracks, he discovered they had been active in the area for at least a week. Multiple kill sites showed where they had taken adult deer, elk, and at least 2 bears. This was not casual hunting for food or sport. This was commercial slaughter designed to strip the mountains of anything valuable. At their main campsite, half a mile from where they had caged the cubs, Tashunka found evidence of a larger operation. Wagon tracks showed heavy loads moving toward the railroad. Scattered papers revealed correspondence with buyers in Denver and Kansas City. These hunters were part of an organized business, one that viewed wildlife as inventory to be harvested and sold. The discovery filled Tashunka with cold understanding. These men were not simply cruel. They were systematic in their cruelty. The mountain lion cubs represented just one transaction in a network of exploitation that stretched across the territory. Fighting them meant challenging something larger than 4 individual hunters, but Apache tradition was clear about such situations. When evil revealed itself, warriors did not calculate odds or consider consequences. They acted according to obligation and honor, trusting that courage would provide what strategy could not. Tashunka returned to his dwelling to gather what he needed for the confrontation ahead. From a hidden cache beneath loose stones, he retrieved his Winchester rifle, the same weapon he had carried as a cavalry scout. He had kept it clean and functional, despite having no use for it in his peaceful canyon life. Now it felt familiar in his hands, awakening muscle memory from battles fought decades earlier. Along with the rifle came other tools of his warrior past: a cavalry-issue revolver, a skinning knife with edge honed to razor sharpness, and field gear designed for extended campaigns. The items had waited patiently for a day when they might again serve the cause of justice. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Tashunka heard horses approaching along the main trail. The hunters were returning to collect their prize, confident that one old Apache posed no serious threat to their business. They rode casually, talking loudly enough for their voices to carry across the canyon. "Should bring good money, those cubs," one voice said. "Circus folks in Denver pay premium for young cats they can train, long as they don't die on us," another replied. "Look, half dead already." "They'll live long enough," came a third voice, harder and more authoritative. "Once we get them to the railroad, there's someone else's problem." Tashunka positioned himself in the rocks above the clearing, his rifle ready but held in reserve. He wanted to try reasoning first. though he held little hope that men capable of such cruelty would respond to moral arguments. The hunters rode into view, 4 men exactly as the tracks had indicated. Their leader was a thick man with gray-streaked beard and expensive gear. The others looked younger, hungrier, and more dangerous in the way of men with nothing to lose. They dismounted near the cage with casual confidence. Well, the leader said, studying the empty water gourd and scattered meat scraps. Someone's been caring for our investment. Mighty neighborly of them. He turned toward the rocks where Tashunka waited. You up there, Chief. Come on down and let's talk this through like civilized folks. Tashunka remained silent, studying the men's positions and weapons. The leader carried a new Winchester, well-maintained and recently cleaned. His tracker bore an older rifle, but handled it with familiarity. The youngest looked uncomfortable with the pistol at his hip, suggesting limited experience with violence. Not feeling talkative? The leader called. That's fine. We can do this easy or hard. Makes no difference to me. Those cubs are coming with us either way. Still, Tashunka waited, letting the man's impatience work against him. Apache warriors understood that silence often accomplished more than words. Let your enemy talk, reveal his intentions, expose his weaknesses through frustration. Listen here, you old savage, the leader continued, his voice carrying rising anger. This is legal business. We got permits from the territorial government to trap predators threatening livestock. You interfere with lawful commerce, and that's a federal crime. The lie came smoothly, practiced through repetition. But Tashunka had lived too long around white men's justice to believe everything spoken. With official authority, if these hunters truly carried legal permits, they would have shown them immediately rather than relying on threats. Finally, Tashunka stood and stepped into view, his rifle held ready but not directly aimed. I have seen your permits, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. They are written in the blood of a mother defending her children. The hunters tensed, hands moving toward weapons. Their leader Morrison, from what Tashunka had overheard, studied him with calculating eyes. Just one old Indian, Morrison said to his men. We can handle this easy enough. The cubs go free, Tashunka declared. Take your wagon and leave this place. There has been enough killing. Morrison laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Free? Old man, those cats are worth $1,500 in Denver. You think I'm walking away from that kind of money because one Apache doesn't like our business? I think, Tashunka replied, quietly, that you have forgotten something important about Apache territory. Some things here do not belong to you. Some things here you cannot take. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, 4 armed men against 1 aging warrior. But something in Tashunka's stillness and the quiet certainty of his voice made the hunters hesitate. This was not what they had expected to find guarding 3 helpless cubs. Last chance, Chief, Morrison said, his hand now resting on his pistol grip. Walk away now, or we'll bury you next to that cat we killed yesterday. Tashunka touched his medicine pouch, feeling the weight of ancestral guidance. His grandfather's words echoed across the decades. When faced with evil, a warrior does not count the cost. He remembers his obligations and acts. I will keep them all, Tashunka said, his voice carrying the weight of sacred oath. This I have promised. This I will do. The words hung in the evening air like smoke from sacred fires, carrying power that made even hardened men step back involuntarily. Morrison's confident smile flickered as he realized he faced something more dangerous than one old Apache with a rifle. He faced a warrior who had already decided to die rather than break his word. The standoff held for long moments, neither side willing to make the first move. Morrison studied Tashunka with new calculation, recognizing something in the Apache's stance that spoke of genuine danger. This was not an old man clinging to faded glory, This was a warrior who had survived decades of conflict by knowing exactly when and how to kill. "You boys spread out," Morrison said quietly to his men. "Take him from 3 sides. He can't watch all of us at once." But as his hunters began to move, Tashunka simply melted backward into the rocks, disappearing as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. One moment he stood visible in the fading light. The next only empty stone remained where he had been. "Where'd he go?" The youngest hunter whispered, his voice tight with sudden fear. Morrison cursed under his breath. "Apache trick. He's still here somewhere, watching us. Nobody move sudden-like. Keep your eyes on those rocks." The silence stretched until it became oppressive. Evening shadows deepened around the clearing, turning familiar shapes into potential threats. Every shifting branch, every bird call from the canyon walls made the hunters flinch and turn. From his hidden position, Tashunka studied his enemies with the patience his grandfather had taught him. The youngest was already breaking his hands, shaking as he gripped his pistol, his eyes darting constantly between the rocks. The tracker remained steady but wary, understanding better than the others how dangerous their situation had become. Morrison himself showed the confidence of a man accustomed to having superior firepower, but even he kept glancing toward escape routes. After 20 minutes of tense waiting, Morrison's patience broke. "To hell with this. Billy, you and Jake load those cubs. We're getting out of here while we still can." The 2 men approached the cage nervously, their rifles held ready. The cubs huddled together in the corner, terrified by the tension they sensed but could not understand. As Billy fumbled with the cage latch, Tashunka made his move. The arrow came from nowhere, appearing suddenly in the ground between Billy's feet. The young hunter screamed and jumped backward, dropping his rifle. The arrow's fletching bore traditional Apache markings, and its placement had been precise enough to pin Billy's bootlace to the earth without touching skin. "Next one finds flesh." Tashunka's voice echoed from the rocks, impossible to locate precisely. "Leave the cubs. Leave this place. Do not return." Morrison raised his Winchester toward the sound, but found only empty air to aim at. "You hear me, Apache? This is your last warning. We got legal permits, and we're taking what's ours." Another arrow appeared, this one slicing through the rope that secured Morrison's saddle. His horse shied away, leaving expensive gear scattered across the ground. The message was clear. Tashunka could have put that arrow through Morrison's heart just as easily. "Jake," Morrison said quietly to his tracker, "can you spot him?" The older hunter shook his head slowly. "He's ghost walking. Could be anywhere in those rocks. This one knows the old ways." From his concealment, Tashunka retrieved his Winchester rifle from its hiding place in the rocks. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, awakening muscle memory. From cavalry battles where he had fought alongside men like these against other Apache warriors. He knew their tactics, their weaknesses, their limitations. But more importantly, he remembered how Apache fighters had consistently defeated larger, better-armed forces through superior knowledge of terrain and willingness to accept casualties. These hunters expected easy profit from helpless animals. They had not prepared for war against someone who understood that some things were worth dying to. Protect Dodd. As darkness settled over the canyon, Tashunka began what Apache warriors called the long hunt, systematic harassment designed to break enemy morale without direct confrontation. Every time the hunters tried to approach the cage, arrows appeared from new directions. When they attempted to mount their horses, their cinches mysteriously loosened. When they built a fire for warmth, smoke began flowing in impossible directions. That made breathing difficult. By midnight, Billy was openly weeping with exhaustion and fear. "We gotta get out of here, Mr. Morrison. This place is cursed." Morrison's confidence had eroded steadily as the night progressed. Each arrow, each mysterious mishap, reinforced the growing conviction that he faced something beyond his experience. One man, he muttered repeatedly. "Just one old Indian." But Jake, the tracker, understood better. "This ain't just one man, boss. This is Apache territory, and we're fighting on his ground. Every rock, every shadow, he knows it all better than we know our own horses." The cubs watched these nocturnal battles with wide, frightened eyes. They pressed against the bars of their cage, seeking what comfort they could find from each other. The largest male, already showing the protective instincts that would mark him as a leader, positioned himself between his siblings and the source of the frightening sounds. Tashunka moved through the darkness like a spirit, using techniques his grandfather had taught him during the long years when Apache warriors held the mountains against cavalry and settlers alike. Every rock formation in this canyon held memories of his youth, every game trail connected to knowledge, passed down through generations of hunters and fighters. The Winchester rifle had been a gift from a cavalry officer, whose life Tashunka had saved during a particularly brutal engagement with hostile Chiricahua. The officer had insisted on the honor despite Army regulations against arming Apache scouts with such weapons. Now the rifle would serve a different cause, protecting innocent life rather than advancing military objectives. As dawn approached, exhaustion and nerves had taken their toll on Morrison's group. They had not slept, had barely eaten, and had spent hours jumping at every sound from the darkness. Their ammunition was running low from firing at shadows, and their horses were spooked beyond easy control. Morrison made his decision as the first. Light touched the canyon walls. "We're pulling back. Regroup at the main camp and figure out a new approach." "What about the cubs?" Billy asked, his young voice hoarse from fear and fatigue. Morrison's eyes hardened as he studied the metal cage. "And its small occupants. They'll keep. This Apache thinks he's won something, but all he's done is buy himself a little time. When we come back, it'll be with enough men to settle this permanently." As the hunters mounted their horses and rode away, their departure carrying more haste than dignity, Tashunka emerged from his concealment. The cubs pressed eagerly against the bars of their cage, seeming to sense that the immediate danger had passed. He knelt beside them, speaking softly in Apache words his grandmother had used to comfort frightened children. The sound of his voice seemed to calm them, their small bodies relaxing slightly, though they remained alert to any new threats. "The first battle is finished, little ones," he told them gently. "But they will return. We must use this time to prepare for what comes next." Opening the cage carefully, Tashunka expected the cubs to bolt for freedom. Instead, they remained huddled together, looking to him for guidance. 3 months of captivity had broken their confidence in the wild world beyond the bars. They would need patience and gentle encouragement to remember what it meant to be mountain lions. Gathering them in his worn cavalry blanket, he carried them toward his dwelling as the sun climbed higher over the canyon walls. They submitted to his handling with trust that filled his heart with both joy and terrible responsibility. These small creatures now depended on him completely for survival, and Morrison's parting words carried the weight of prophecy. The war for 3 small lives had only begun. During the following days, Tashunka worked methodically to prepare for Morrison's return while nursing the cubs back to health. His dwelling, carved into the canyon wall and hidden by carefully cultivated vegetation, became a sanctuary designed to protect its small inhabitants. The cubs responded to care with remarkable resilience. Within 2 days, they were drinking water regularly and eating small pieces of meat. By the end of the first week, they had begun exploring their new surroundings with cautious curiosity. The largest male, whom Tashunka had begun calling Little Warrior for his bold spirit, showed particular recovery, often standing guard while his siblings slept. But healing the cubs' bodies proved easier than restoring their confidence. Months in captivity had taught them to fear open spaces and sudden movements. They followed Tashunka constantly, seeming to believe that safety existed only within arm's reach of their protector. When he ventured outside to gather food or scout for approaching danger, they would cry pitifully until his return. This dependency troubled Tashunka deeply. His goal was not to domesticate these wild creatures, but to restore them to their natural state. Mountain lions belonged in the high country, hunting their own prey and raising their own young. Yet every day of care seemed to make them more reliant on human protection. On the 5th morning after Morrison's retreat, Tashunka performed the ritual his grandfather had taught him for seeking spiritual guidance in times of crucial decision. He withdrew an eagle feather from his medicine pouch, a sacred item that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, and held it while offering prayers to the 4 directions. The eagle feather carried particular significance in Apache tradition. Eagles flew closer to the Creator than any other creature, making them ideal messengers between the physical and spiritual worlds. When a warrior faced choices that would affect innocent lives, he sought the wisdom of ancestors through such sacred objects. As Tashunka held the feather and spoke the ancient words, images filled his mind with startling clarity. He saw the cubs as adults, powerful and free, hunting the high ridges where their mother had once ruled. He saw himself as an old man watching them from a distance, knowing that his promise had been fulfilled. But he also saw darker visions. Morrison returning with more men, the cubs trapped again, their brief taste of freedom ending in cages or death. The spiritual guidance that came to him was both reassuring and demanding. The path he had chosen was correct, but it would require more sacrifice than he had initially understood. Protecting the cubs meant not just fighting Morrison, but confronting the entire system that allowed such cruelty to exist under the guise of legal commerce. When the ceremony ended, Tashunka felt renewed confidence in his mission. The eagle feather had confirmed what his heart already knew: some obligations transcended personal safety or comfort. These cubs represented innocence itself, and innocence deserved protection regardless of cost. That afternoon, as he worked to improve the defensive preparations around his dwelling, Tashunka heard horses approaching. But this time, only 2 riders appeared: Morrison and his tracker Jake, both looking worse for wear after their previous encounter. Morrison dismounted near the empty cage, studying the scattered arrows and disturbed ground with obvious frustration. "Come on out, Apache," he called. "We need to talk this through like reasonable men." Tashunka remained hidden, watching as Morrison gestured for Jake to scout the surrounding rocks. The tracker moved reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with returning to a place where he had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered. "I know you're listening," Morrison continued, his voice carrying forced reasonableness. "What happened the other night? It was just a misunderstanding. Billy got spooked, started shooting at shadows. Made everybody nervous." Still, Tashunka waited, studying the men's body language and equipment. Morrison carried the same Winchester, but now wore a pistol as well, suggesting he expected closer combat. Jake bore additional ammunition and what looked like rope, probably intended for securing prisoners. "Look," Morrison said, growing impatient with the silence. "I'm a businessman, not a killer. Those cubs are worth money to me alive, which means keeping them healthy and safe. You think I want to hurt innocent animals?" The lie came smoothly, but Tashunka remembered the blood-stained rock and the mother cat's tortured death. Morrison's definition of safe had nothing to do with the cubs' welfare and everything to do with their commercial value. "I'll make you a deal," Morrison called toward the rocks. "You help me get those cubs to Denver, and I'll cut you in for a share of the profits. $200 cash money, more than most Indians see in 5 years. The attempted bribery revealed Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of Apache values. He assumed that every man could be bought. The principles were simply another form of commerce to be negotiated. Such thinking explained how he justified torturing animals for profit. From his concealment, Tashunka could see the cubs hidden in a shallow cave behind his dwelling. They had learned to remain silent during human visits, pressing together for comfort while trusting their protector to keep them safe. Their golden eyes watched the entrance, alert but unafraid, because his presence told them no immediate danger threatened. "Last chance for easy money," Morrison said, his reasonable tone beginning to crack. "After today, this gets complicated in ways you won't like." When no response came, Morrison's facade collapsed entirely. "Have it your way, you stubborn savage, but don't think this is over. I've got connections in the territorial government, friends who understand the importance of legal commerce. Next time I come back, it'll be with federal marshals and enough firepower to level this whole canyon." The threat carried real weight. Morrison clearly had resources beyond simple hired guns. The expensive equipment, the confidence in his legal position, the casual mention of government connections all suggested backing from powerful interests. Jake mounted his horse with obvious relief, eager to leave before violence erupted again. But as they prepared to ride away, Morrison turned back toward the rocks one final time. "You think you're protecting those cubs? You're condemning them to slow death in a wilderness that don't want them anymore. At least in Denver they'd have regular food, warm shelter, people who understand their value." The words stung because they contained a grain of truth that Tashunka had been trying to ignore. The traditional Apache territory was shrinking daily as settlers claimed more land, and hunters eliminated the prey species that mountain lions needed for survival. Even if he succeeded in returning the cubs to the wild, they would face challenges their ancestors had never encountered. But the alternative, caging magnificent predators for human entertainment, violated everything Apache tradition taught about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Some things were worth more than safety or convenience. Freedom, dignity, and the right to live according to one's true nature ranked among those precious things. After Morrison and Jake rode away, Tashunka emerged from hiding to find the cubs waiting anxiously near the cave entrance. Little Warrior approached him with the particular confidence that marked natural leaders, while his siblings followed more cautiously. "They will return," Tashunka told them softly, kneeling to accept their trust as they pressed against him for comfort. "But they will find us ready. Your mother died fighting for your freedom. I will not let her sacrifice be meaningless." The eagle feather lay warm against his chest, still carrying the spiritual energy from that morning's ceremony. Its presence reminded him that some battles were fought not just for immediate victory, but for principles that outlasted individual lives. Morrison would return with greater force and legal authority. The cubs would need more than hiding places and defensive preparations. They would need a guardian willing to sacrifice everything for their future. Tashunka had made his choice. Now he must prepare for its consequences. Over the following week, Tashunka transformed his peaceful canyon into a battlefield designed to neutralize the advantages of superior numbers. But first, he attended to an obligation that went deeper than military strategy thought in the hour before. Dawn, when the world balanced between darkness and light. He prepared the sacred war paint that Apache warriors had used for generations. The pigments came from earth he had gathered at sacred sites, red ochre from the place where his grandfather was born, black charcoal from lightning-struck trees, white clay from the springs where spirits dwelled, mixing the pigments with water. Blessed through proper ceremony, Tashunka applied the traditional markings that announced his transformation from peaceful elder to protective warrior. Red stripes across his cheekbones honored the blood of ancestors who had died defending their people. Black circles around his eyes sharpened his vision for the battles ahead. White symbols on his forehead connected him to spiritual guidance. From the world beyond, the war paint served purposes beyond intimidation or identification. For Apache warriors, these markings created a sacred boundary between ordinary life and the special state of consciousness required for righteous combat. Wearing them meant accepting that survival was less important than fulfilling one's obligations to protect the innocent dot as he painted the final symbols. Tashunka felt his grandfather's presence filling the small space of his dwelling. The old warrior had worn similar markings during the long years of resistance against cavalry forces. Now his knowledge flowed through blood and memory to guide his grandson's preparations. The cubs watched this ceremony with unusual stillness, seeming to sense its significance. Little warrior crept closer as Tashunka worked, studying the human's face with intelligent eyes. Something in the cub's expression suggested recognition, not of the specific ritual, but of the determination it represented. "You understand, little one," Tashunka said softly. "Your mother wore different markings, but they carried the same meaning. Sometimes fighting becomes necessary to protect what cannot protect itself." With the war paint complete, he began practical preparations that would give meaning to its spiritual significance. His first task involved sabotaging the trap lines Morrison's men had set throughout the canyon during their previous visits. The hunters had been busy during their brief stay, placing snares and deadfalls designed to capture additional mountain lions attracted to the area. These traps showed professional craftsmanship. They would kill quickly and cleanly, preserving the pelts that commanded high prices in eastern markets. But the traps also revealed the true scope of Morrison's operation. This was not simply about 3 orphaned cubs. Morrison intended to strip these mountains of every valuable predator, turning a thriving ecosystem into empty wasteland for the sake of short-term profit. Tashunka dismantled each trap carefully, leaving Apache warning signs that would be unmistakable to anyone familiar with traditional symbols. Crossed arrows bound with red cloth meant death waits here. Stones arranged in specific patterns warned that the area was under protection of Apache spirits. Owl feathers tied to prominent branches announced that enemies were being watched. These warnings served multiple purposes. They would unnerve Morrison's men, most of whom harbored deep superstitions about Apache spiritual power. They would also alert any Apache people passing through the area that one of their own was engaged in sacred battle and might need assistance. But most importantly, the warning signs claimed this territory according to laws older than any government treaty. Apache tradition held that warriors fighting to protect innocent life could invoke special sanctions that made their battleground temporarily sacred. Violating such places brought spiritual consequences that lasted beyond individual lifetimes. As he worked, Tashunka discovered fresh sign that chilled his blood. Multiple sets of boot prints showed that Morrison had returned during the night, with at least 6 men. They had scouted the canyon thoroughly, identifying defensive positions and escape routes with military precision. Worse, they had found the cave system where he planned to hide the cubs during the final confrontation. Boot prints led directly to the entrance, and scattered cigarette butts showed they had spent considerable time studying the tunnels within. The discovery forced immediate changes to his defensive strategy. The caves could no longer serve as a secure refuge. Morrison's men would expect to find the cubs there and would focus their assault accordingly. New hiding places had to be prepared, ones that relied on deception rather than simple concealment. Tashunka spent the remainder of the day creating false trails and dummy positions designed to confuse attackers about his actual intentions. He cached weapons and supplies at multiple locations, ensuring he could continue fighting even if driven from his primary stronghold. Most crucially, he prepared a series of escape routes that only someone intimate with local terrain could follow. In darkness or under pressure, the cubs adapted to these preparations with remarkable intelligence. They seemed to understand that their protector was preparing for serious danger, and they stayed close without interfering with his work. Little Warrior established himself as guardian of his siblings, positioning himself between them and any potential threats while allowing his protector to focus on larger preparations. That evening, as Tashunka completed his defensive arrangements, he heard the sound that confirmed his worst fears. a large group of horsemen approaching along the main trail. Morrison had returned with significant reinforcements, and the final battle was beginning. But this time, the hunters would discover that one Apache warrior with proper motivation and intimate knowledge of local terrain could inflict casualties far beyond his numerical disadvantage. They would learn that some promises carried weight beyond bullets or legal documents. Most importantly, they would face an enemy who had accepted death as preferable to breaking his word. Apache war paint did not wash off until victory was achieved, or the warrior wearing it died in honorable combat. From his concealed position, Tashunka watched Morrison's enlarged force spread through the canyon with professional efficiency. These were not the nervous amateurs who had fled after the previous encounter. These men moved with confidence born of superior numbers and firepower, but they were entering territory that had been prepared to receive them. Every rock, every shadow, every approach route had been transformed into part of a defensive network designed by someone who understood both Apache tactics and cavalry procedures. The cubs waited in their new hiding place, a narrow crevice behind his dwelling that appeared too small for human entry, but opened into a larger chamber beyond. They could hear the approaching horses and men's voices, but their protector's calm presence told them no immediate danger threatened. Tashunka touched his medicine pouch one final time, feeling the weight of ancestral guidance. His grandfather's war paint made him part of something larger than individual survival, a tradition of warriors who had chosen honor over safety, principle over comfort. Morrison wanted 3 small lives for commercial profit. He would discover that some things cost more than money could purchase, and some enemies fought for reasons beyond his understanding. The war for 3 orphaned cubs was about to become something much larger. The riders came hard and fast, their approach announcing confidence born of superior numbers and firepower. Morrison rode at their head, his expensive gear contrasting sharply with the worn clothing and practical weapons of his hired men. These were indeed hard cases, men whose faces carried the particular emptiness that came from too much violence and too little conscience. From his concealed position, Tashunka counted 8 men plus Morrison himself. Professional soldiers from their coordination and discipline. Ex-cavalry, most likely. Veterans of the Indian Wars who understood tactics, terrain advantage, and coordinated assault. They would not be easily discouraged by arrows from the darkness or psychological warfare. But hidden beneath his shirt, Tashunka carried something that connected him to conflicts these men could not imagine. His old cavalry Medal of Bronze star, awarded for valor during a particularly brutal engagement, pressed against his chest like a talisman. The irony was bitter and sharp. He had earned this honor fighting alongside cavalry units against his own people, proving his courage to men who would never see him as equal. The medal represented everything contradictory about his service as an Apache scout. He had saved cavalry lives, guided successful missions, earned respect through skill and loyalty. Yet the same army that honored his service had also burned Apache villages, scattered families, and confined proud people to reservation boundaries. Now that same military training would serve a different cause. The tactics he had learned fighting. For the cavalry, he would use fighting against men cut from similar cloth. The bitter circle of his life was closing in ways his younger self could never have anticipated. Tashunka, Morrison called, his voice echoing off canyon walls. We know you're here somewhere. Come out peaceful-like, and this doesn't have to get ugly. The Apache remained silent, studying how each man positioned himself. Professional soldiers revealed their intentions through small details, the angle they held their rifles, which direction they faced while waiting, how quickly they moved to cover when exposed. These details told him more about their capabilities than any amount of direct observation could reveal. Morrison had learned from his previous encounters. Instead of spreading his men randomly through the canyon, he positioned them in overlapping fields of fire that covered all apparent escape routes. 2 men watched the main trail. 2 more covered the cliff approaches, and the remainder focused on the dwelling itself. "Have it your way," Morrison continued when no response came. "Boys, tear this place apart. Find those cubs and find the Indian. $10 bonus to whoever brings me his scalp." A systematic search began with military precision. They moved in pairs, covering each other while investigating every possible hiding place. Their coordination spoke of shared experience in similar operations, probably clearing Apache strongholds during the final years of the resistance. But they were searching for a peaceful Apache dwelling, not a warrior's prepared battlefield. As the first pair approached Tashunka's actual position, they triggered the beginning of a carefully orchestrated defense. The arrow that took down the lead man came from an impossible angle, arcing over rocks and through scrub brush to find its target with precision that spoke of decades of practice. The man dropped with an Apache war arrow through his shoulder, alive but effectively removed from the fight. His partner immediately took cover and began scanning for the archer's position. "Morrison, contact!" North side, maybe 50 yards up the slope. But even as he spoke, 2 more arrows appeared from completely different directions, one pinning another searcher's boot to a wooden beam, the other slicing through a third man's gun belt and sending his ammunition scattered across rocky ground. "How many of them are there?" One of the hired guns shouted, panic beginning to edge his voice. Morrison studied the arrows with growing unease. All bore identical fletching, all had been fired with identical precision. Either multiple Apache warriors had appeared from nowhere, or they faced a single archer moving between positions with impossible speed. "Just one," he said grimly, though doubt crept into his voice. "But he knows every rock in this place." The professional calm of his hired soldiers began cracking as they realized they fought an enemy who could strike from any direction without warning. Every shadow became a potential threat, every sound from the canyon walls a possible approach. Tashunka used their uncertainty to begin the second phase of his defense. From his concealed rifle position, he began placing shots designed to wound rather than kill, a graze across one man's arm that sent him diving for cover, a bullet through another's hat that reminded him how close death could come. The cavalry. Metal burned against his chest as he fought, each shot awakening memories of similar battles fought from the other side. He had been with cavalry units when they assaulted Apache positions, had seen how effectively a single determined warrior could hold superior forces at bay through intimate knowledge of terrain and absolute commitment to cause. Now he was that single warrior, drawing on everything he had learned during years of service to an army that had ultimately betrayed his people's trust. The tactics were familiar, but the motivation had reversed completely. "Spread out," Morrison commanded, his earlier confidence shaking. "He can't watch all of us at once." But as his men attempted to comply, they discovered that Tashunka had prepared for exactly this tactic. Hidden pits covered with brush and leaves sent 2 men tumbling into carefully constructed traps. Tripwires connected to noisemakers revealed the position of anyone trying to move stealthily through the undergrowth. Most disturbing of all, Apache war cries began echoing from the canyon walls, the traditional calls warriors used to communicate during battle. To men unfamiliar with such sounds, the cries suggested multiple attackers coordinating their assault. Even those who recognized them as coming from a single throat found them unsettling reminders of battles fought against Apache warriors in their prime. The cubs, hidden in their secure crevice, listened to these sounds with unusual calm. Something in the war cries spoke to instincts deeper than learned fear. Their protector was not just fighting. He was honoring traditions that connected him to something larger than individual survival. By midday, Morrison's overwhelming numerical advantage had been reduced to tactical parity. 3 of his men were wounded and out of action, 2 more were trapped in hidden pits awaiting rescue, and the remainder were too unnerved to advance aggressively. "This is getting expensive," one of the ex-cavalrymen muttered as he bandaged a graze on his partner's arm. "Morrison didn't mention we'd be fighting a whole Apache war party." "It's just one man," Morrison insisted, though his own confidence had clearly shaken. "One crazy old Indian with a grudge. One crazy old Indian who's making us look like fools," another hired gun observed. "Maybe we should cut our losses and ride out of here." But Morrison's pride had been engaged as much as his business interests. The cavalry medal hidden beneath Tashunka's shirt was not the only military decoration present in this canyon. Morrison himself wore the faded insignia of a former cavalry officer, and his professional reputation depended on successfully completing difficult operations. Backing down now would mean admitting that a single Apache warrior had defeated 9 armed men through superior tactics and local knowledge. Such a story would follow him throughout the territory, damaging his reputation and reducing his ability to hire competent help for future operations. "Nobody's riding anywhere," he declared. "We came here for those cubs, and we're not leaving without them." As afternoon shadows began lengthening, Morrison prepared his desperate gamble, one that would test whether Tashunka's commitment to protecting the cubs exceeded his attachment to his own life. As afternoon shadows deepened, Tashunka noticed something that chilled his blood more than Morrison's superior numbers. One of the hired guns had been systematically searching through the scattered papers from Morrison's saddlebags, documents that had fallen during the earlier arrow attack on his gear. The man's behavior suggested he was looking for something specific, not just reorganizing scattered supplies. When he found what he sought, his expression changed from casual interest to sharp attention. He studied a particular letter with growing intensity before calling Morrison over with urgent gestures. From his concealed position, Tashunka could not read the document, but he could observe the effect it had on both men. Morrison's face went pale as he read, and his previous confidence transformed into something approaching panic. The 2 men spoke in heated whispers, their body language suggesting serious disagreement about how to proceed. The exchange lasted several minutes before Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone present. Instead of continuing the assault, he called his men back to a defensive perimeter and ordered them to make camp. "We're staying the night," he announced. "Set watches and prepare for a long wait." This situation just got more complicated. The sudden change in tactics puzzled Morrison's hired soldiers, who had been prepared for continued assault. But they followed orders, establishing a defensive camp that effectively surrounded Tashunka's position while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid his arrow's dart as evening approached. Morrison made an unexpected move. He approached the center of the clearing alone, carrying a white cloth tied to his rifle barrel, the traditional signal for parley. "Apache," he called. "I know you can hear me. We need to talk, and I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Tashunka remained hidden, studying Morrison's demeanor for signs of deception. The hunter's earlier arrogance had been replaced by something resembling desperation, suggesting that whatever information the letter contained had fundamentally altered his calculations. "I'm going to leave some papers here," Morrison continued, placing several documents on the blood-stained rock where the cub's mother had died. "Read them when you get the chance. Then we'll talk about how this really has to end." After Morrison retreated to his defensive perimeter, Tashunka waited until full darkness before investigating the documents. What he found changed everything. He thought he understood about the situation. The first letter bore official letterhead from the U.S. Department of the Interior, specifically the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was addressed to Morrison personally and dated just 2 weeks earlier. The content made Tashunka's blood run cold. "Mr. Morrison, your request for assistance in removing illegal Apache presence from designated hunting areas has been approved. Federal Marshal Thompson will arrive within 30 days to provide official backing for your commercial operations. Any Apache found interfering with lawful business will be arrested for violation of reservation boundaries and transported to military custody in New Mexico territory. The second document was even more damning. A detailed report describing Tashunka by name as a rogue Apache conducting unauthorized activities outside reservation limits. The report claimed he had been stealing livestock, threatening settlers, and generally violating the terms of his supervised release. But it was the third letter that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against him. Written on expensive stationery, bearing the seal of a major eastern city, it outlined a commercial operation far larger than simple animal capture. Morrison, the demand for exotic predators continues to exceed supply. Our buyers in New York and Boston are prepared to pay premium prices for live mountain lions, particularly cubs that can be trained for exhibition purposes. Your territory has been identified as the primary source for such specimens. Eliminate any local interference and proceed with full-scale harvesting operations. The letter was signed by someone identifying himself as a representative of Western Wildlife Enterprises, apparently a front organization for wealthy Easterners who collected exotic animals as status symbols. As Tashunka absorbed the implications of these revelations, he understood that his conflict with Morrison was merely one small part of a much larger operation. The 3 cubs he had sworn to protect represented just the beginning of a systematic effort to strip the entire territory of its predator population. Worse, the first letter revealed that Morrison's claims about legal permits had not been entirely false. He did have government backing, corrupted and purchased, but technically official. This meant that federal law was now aligned against Tashunka, turning his righteous defense of innocent creatures into criminal activity under territorial statutes. But the final document in Morrison's collection provided the most shocking revelation of all. It was a wanted poster bearing Tashunka's name and offering a substantial reward for his capture, not for protecting mountain lion cubs, but for the murder of a federal wildlife inspector who had disappeared in the area 3 months earlier. The poster described the missing inspector as James Crawford, age 34, last seen investigating reports of illegal hunting activities in the Dragoon Mountains. It claimed that Tashunka had been identified as the last person to see Crawford alive, and that Apache warriors were known to kill government officials who interfered with their traditional hunting grounds. Reading this fabricated accusation, Tashunka finally understood the full scope of Morrison's operation. The hunter had not simply been capturing animals illegally. He had murdered a federal inspector who had gotten too close to exposing the commercial network behind the wildlife trafficking. Now, Morrison was using Tashunka as a convenient scapegoat, claiming that a rogue Apache had killed the inspector to protect tribal hunting rights. The story would be readily believed by territorial authorities already suspicious of Apache compliance with reservation regulations. This revelation transformed the entire conflict. Tashunka was no longer simply fighting to protect 3 orphan cubs. He was fighting to clear his name of a murder he had not committed while exposing a criminal conspiracy that reached from frontier hunting camps to eastern cities. The cubs' mother had not been killed by simple hunters seeking profit. She had been murdered by men implementing a systematic plan to eliminate apex predators throughout the territory. Her cubs were not random victims, but specifically targeted specimens for a commercial operation that viewed all wildlife as inventory to be harvested and sold. Morrison's confidence in involving federal authority now made perfect sense. He had already established Tashunka as a convenient villain for the inspector's murder. Capturing or killing him while rescuing the stolen cubs would complete a narrative that protected the real criminals while eliminating the primary witness to their activities. As Tashunka finished reading the documents, he heard Morrison calling. from the defensive perimeter. You've had time to read them by now, Apache. Understand your situation yet? Tashunka emerged from concealment, standing in the moonlight where Morrison could see him clearly. The war paint on his face looked even more fierce in the pale illumination, and his rifle was held with casual competence. I understand that you killed a federal inspector, Tashunka replied, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. I understand that you plan to blame his murder on me. I understand that you think federal authority will protect you from the consequences of your crimes. Morrison's laugh carried genuine amusement. Smart, Apache. Yes, Crawford got too close to our operation, started asking inconvenient questions. Had to be eliminated before he could file his report with Washington. But you made one mistake. Tashunka continued. You assumed that Apache people would not understand your white man's legal system well enough to turn it against you. What's that supposed to mean? Tashunka smiled grimly. It means that Inspector Crawford was not the only federal official investigating illegal hunting activities in this territory. It means that his disappearance has attracted attention from people you have not yet corrupted. And it means that your letters and documents will be very interesting to honest authorities when they arrive. The bluff was calculated to undermine Morrison's confidence and buy time for developing a strategy to deal with the expanded threat. But as Tashunka spoke, he realized that his words might carry more truth than he had intended. Federal inspectors rarely worked alone, and Crawford's disappearance would have triggered investigations by people outside Morrison's sphere of influence. The very documents Morrison had used to threaten him might also provide evidence of the corruption that had led to Crawford's murder. You're lying, Morrison said, but doubt crept into his voice. Am I? Tashunka asked calmly. Then, why are you so eager to eliminate the only witness to your inspector's murder? Why not simply wait for federal authorities to arrest me for crimes I did not commit? The question hung in the night air, carrying weight that made Morrison's hired guns shift nervously. They had signed on to capture illegal animals and arrest a rogue Apache. They had not been told they were participating in covering up the murder of a federal officer. For the first time since the conflict began, Morrison found himself on the defensive, forced to justify his actions rather than simply imposing his will through superior force. The revelation about Inspector Crawford's murder had shaken Morrison's hired guns more than Tashunka had expected. Men willing to capture animals illegally or arrest a rogue, Apache drew different moral lines when it came to covering up federal officer killings. By dawn, 2 of them had quietly slipped away during the night watches, taking their horses and equipment rather than risk involvement in something that could lead to federal prosecution. Morrison discovered their desertion as the sun crested the canyon walls, his cursing echoing off the rocks as he realized his numerical advantage had shrunk considerably. The remaining men looked uncomfortable, shifting nervously as they avoided meeting their employer's eyes. Anybody else feeling yellow? Morrison snarled at his remaining forces. Because if you're planning to run, now's the time to speak up. The silence that greeted his challenge carried its own answer. These men would stay, but their earlier confidence had evaporated. They understood now that they faced more than one Apache warrior defending 3 cubs. They were involved in a conspiracy that could destroy their lives if exposed. From his concealed position, Tashunka watched Morrison's diminished force with calculating eyes. 7 men remained, but their morale had cracked. More importantly, they now viewed Morrison with suspicion rather than simple employment loyalty. Such divisions could be exploited by someone who understood how to turn enemies against each other. But first, he had a sacred obligation to fulfill. In his hiding place, the 3 cubs waited with unusual stillness, seeming to sense that the final confrontation approached. Little Warrior had positioned himself between his siblings and the cave entrance, his small body radiating protective determination that reminded Tashunka powerfully of their mother's sacrifice. Reaching into his medicine pouch, Tashunka withdrew materials for creating an Apache battle standard, the sacred symbol warriors carried when fighting for causes larger than personal survival. Using strips of hide, eagle feathers, and sacred stones blessed through proper ceremony, he constructed the traditional marker that would announce his commitment to die rather than surrender his charges. The process required careful attention to spiritual details that connected the physical banner to ancestral power. Each knot tied with specific prayers, each feather positioned according to visions received during vision quests, each stone selected for its connection to sacred places where Apache warriors had proven their courage. When completed, the battle standard represented more than personal determination. It embodied the collective will of generations of Apache defenders who had chosen honor over survival. Carrying it meant accepting that spiritual obligations outweighed physical safety. As Tashunka worked, memories flooded through him of other warriors who had created similar standards during the final years of Apache resistance. He had been present when Geronimo himself had prepared such a banner before the last great raid against Mexican settlements. He had watched young warriors tie sacred objects to lances. Before riding into battles they knew they might not survive. Now he was the old warrior, preparing his own sacred marker for what might be his final fight. The irony was not lost on him. He who had survived the cavalry wars, the reservation years, and decades of enforced peace, would likely die defending 3 orphaned cubs from men who viewed them as commercial inventory. But Apache tradition taught that some deaths carried more meaning than years of ordinary life. To die protecting innocent creatures while upholding sacred promises ranked among the most honorable endings a warrior could achieve. The cubs watched his preparations with unusual intensity, their golden eyes following each movement as he blessed the battle standard and secured it to a lance inherited from his grandfather. When he spoke to them in the soft Apache words his grandmother had used for frightened children, they pressed closer to receive comfort from his presence. "The time has come, little ones," he told them gently. "Your protector must now prove whether his promises carry the weight of truth or merely the emptiness of words spoken without commitment." Little warrior approached him boldly, reaching out with one small paw to touch the battle standard. The gesture sent electricity through Tashunka's body recognition, passing between warrior spirits separated by species, but united in purpose. Outside, Morrison had made his own preparations for the final assault. Unable to rely on the loyalty of hired guns who now questioned his honesty, he had decided on a strategy that would force Tashunka into direct confrontation. "Listen up, Apache," Morrison called across the clearing. "I'm done playing games with you. You got exactly 1 hour to surrender those cubs and yourself, or I start using dynamite to bring down this whole canyon." The threat was not empty bluster. Morrison's men had indeed brought explosives, enough to collapse the rock formations. That provided Tashunka's tactical advantage. Worse, the blast might seal the cave systems throughout the area, trapping the cubs beyond any hope of rescue. "You think I won't do it?" Morrison continued. "Ask your friends who ran off last night. They saw what happened to Inspector Crawford when he thought I was bluffing about permanent solutions to temporary problems." From his position, Tashunka could see the wooden boxes that contained Morrison's dynamite supply. The placement revealed professional knowledge of demolition. The charges would indeed bring down massive amounts of rock if detonated simultaneously, but Morrison's ultimatum also revealed desperation. A man confident in his position did not resort to threats that would destroy the very prize he sought to claim. The cubs were valuable only if captured alive. Dynamite explosions that collapsed their hiding places would eliminate any possibility of profit from their sale. This contradiction suggested that Morrison's situation had become as precarious as his opponent's. Perhaps federal investigators were indeed closing in on his operation. Perhaps his Eastern backers were demanding results regardless of methods. Or perhaps the revelation of Inspector Crawford's murder had created legal complications that made quick resolution imperative. Regardless of Morrison's specific motivations, his ultimatum forced Tashunka to accept the final phase of their conflict. No more tactical delays, no more psychological warfare. The time had come for direct confrontation that would determine whether 3 small lives continued or ended in this remote canyon. Tashunka performed one last ritual before emerging to face Morrison's forces. Holding his grandfather's war pipe, he offered smoke to the 4 directions while speaking the traditional prayers warriors used before battle. The ceremony connected him to ancestral spirits who had faced similar choices in their own times. The pipe smoke carried his words beyond the physical world, seeking guidance from warriors who understood the weight of sacred obligations. As the aromatic cloud dispersed in the morning air, Tashunka felt the presence of his grandfather settling around his shoulders like a protective blanket. "Guide my hands and steady my aim," he whispered to the spirit presence. "Let my sacrifice have meaning, and let these innocent ones find the freedom their mother died seeking." When the ceremony ended, Tashunka gathered his weapons and prepared for the confrontation that would end this conflict one way or another. His Winchester rifle carried 17 rounds, enough for each of Morrison's remaining men if his aim proved true. His cavalry revolver held 6 more shots for close combat. His grandfather's war axe hung at his side, ready for hand-to-hand fighting if ammunition failed. But most importantly, he carried the battle standard that announced his spiritual commitment to the cause. Whatever happened in the coming fight, he would face it with honor intact and promises kept. The cubs seemed to understand that separation was coming. They pressed against him one final time, accepting comfort and offering their own small gestures of affection. Little Warrior stood tallest, his young chest puffed with determination that suggested he would fight alongside his protector if permitted. "No, brave one," Tashunka said softly, restraining the cub with gentle hands. "Your battle comes later, when you are grown and strong enough to protect cubs your own. Today you must trust me to keep you safe, as your mother trusted me to keep my promise." He secured the cubs in their deepest hiding place, one that would protect them from dynamite blasts or rifle fire. Fresh water and meat would sustain them for several days if necessary. More importantly, the hiding place connected to tunnel systems. That led to other exits if he failed to survive the coming battle. The cubs might still escape to find their own path to freedom. As the sun climbed higher and Morrison's ultimatum deadline approached, Tashunka emerged from concealment for the final time. He stood in clear view of his enemies, the sacred battle standard planted firmly beside him, and his rifle held with casual competence. The war paint on his face caught the morning light, transforming weathered features into the mask of judgment itself. His grandfather's medals and sacred items gleamed on his chest, announcing his connection to warrior traditions that stretched back through generations of Apache defenders. "Morrison," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "Your hour has passed. If you want these cubs, come and take them. But know that you will purchase them with blood, and the price may be higher than you are prepared to pay." The challenge hung in the desert air like smoke from sacred fires, carrying power that made even hardened gunmen step back involuntarily. This was no longer a business dispute about stolen property. This was a warrior's call to sacred combat, with stakes that went beyond commercial profit or personal survival. Morrison studied his opponent and realized that something fundamental had changed overnight. The Apache standing before him was not the same man who had been harassing his forces with arrows and guerrilla tactics. This was a warrior who had accepted death as preferable to defeat, making him infinitely more dangerous than someone fighting merely to survive. The final battle was about to begin. Morrison's assault began at precisely noon. His remaining 7 men advancing in coordinated formation that demonstrated their military background. But as they moved through the canyon, they discovered that Tashunka had transformed familiar terrain into a maze of deadly surprises. The first casualty came from a hidden pit that sent a hired gun tumbling into sharpened stakes. His screams echoed off the canyon walls, unnerving his companions and announcing that their Apache opponent had prepared for exactly this type of coordinated assault. Tashunka's opening shots came from 3 different positions, fired so rapidly that Morrison's men initially believed they faced multiple snipers. The Winchester rounds found their targets with precision that spoke of decades of practice. One man down with a shoulder wound, another diving for cover as a bullet shattered the rock beside his head. From his concealed position behind carefully arranged boulders, Tashunka had established overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach to the cub's hiding place. But more importantly, he had arranged sacred stones around the perimeter ancient Apache markers that designated this ground as spiritually protected territory. The stones carried power beyond their symbolic significance. According to Apache tradition, warriors fighting to protect innocent life could invoke ancestral protection that made their battleground temporarily sacred. Enemies who violated such places faced spiritual consequences that lasted beyond individual lifetimes. Morrison's men sensed this supernatural dimension without fully understanding it. The stones seemed to watch them with invisible eyes, and the very air felt charged with hostile presence. Even hardened gunfighters found themselves glancing nervously at shadows that moved without wind to stir them. "Spread out," Morrison commanded, but his voice carried less authority than before. "He's just one man. We've got him outnumbered and outgunned." But as his men attempted to comply, they discovered that numerical advantage meant little against an enemy who knew every rock formation and had prepared each position for maximum defensive benefit. Tashunka moved between firing positions like a ghost, appearing long enough to deliver deadly, accurate shots, before vanishing into terrain that seemed to swallow him completely. His tactics combined everything he had learned during 40 years of survival in hostile territory. Apache guerrilla methods learned during the resistance years merged with cavalry procedures absorbed during his time as a scout. Most importantly, he fought with the absolute conviction that came from defending something sacred. Each shot he fired carried the weight of his promise to the cubs. Each movement between positions honored his grandfather's teachings about warrior obligations. Each moment of this battle connected him to generations of Apache defenders who had chosen principle over survival. The cubs, hidden in their secure crevice, could hear the sounds of combat but remained calm because their protector's presence continued to reach them. Little Warrior maintained his guard position, ready to defend his siblings if enemies somehow penetrated their sanctuary. By mid-afternoon, Morrison's force had been reduced to 4 effective fighters. 2 men were wounded and out of action. 1 had fled after Tashunka's psychological warfare broke his nerve, and the remainder were pinned down by relentless, accurate fire from positions they could not identify. "This is madness," one of the survivors shouted to Morrison. "We're being picked apart by one old Apache. Cut your losses and let's get out of here." But Morrison's pride had been engaged beyond rational calculation. He had invested too much money, suffered too much humiliation, and committed too many crimes to abandon his prize now. The cubs represented more than commercial profit. They had become symbols of his ability to impose his will on a world that increasingly seemed to resist his authority. "No retreat," he snarled. "We finish this here and now. I don't care if we have to burn down the whole canyon." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Morrison prepared his most desperate gamble, yet a direct assault on Tashunka's position, using the last of his explosives. If he could not outfight one Apache warrior, he would eliminate the terrain advantage that made such resistance possible. The sacred stone seemed to pulse with increased energy as the final phase of battle approached. And somewhere in the distance, ravens began gathering as if summoned by ancient powers to witness the conclusion of this conflict between old ways and new greed. The explosion shattered the afternoon silence, sending rocks cascading down the canyon walls as Morrison's dynamite eliminated Tashunka's primary defensive position. But instead of exposing the Apache warrior to final assault, the blast revealed something that made Morrison's blood run cold. Tashunka, standing calmly in clear view, holding an ancient arrowhead that gleamed with dark stains. The blood-stained arrowhead had belonged to Tashunka's great-grandfather, a weapon that had drawn enemy blood in battles fought before white men ever saw these mountains. According to Apache tradition, such weapons carried the spirits of every warrior who had wielded them, making them infinitely more dangerous than modern firearms in the hands of someone fighting for sacred causes. You want to end this with explosives and bullets, Tashunka called across the rubble-strewn clearing. But some battles can only be finished according to older laws. Morrison raised his Winchester, but something in the Apache's bearing made him hesitate. This was not the tactical fighter who had been harassing his forces from concealment. This was a spiritual warrior who had transcended concern for personal survival, making him as dangerous as any force Morrison had ever encountered. "Just shoot him," one of the remaining hired guns shouted. "He's standing right there in the open." But as Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, Tashunka moved with speed that seemed impossible for a man of his years. The ancient arrowhead flew from his hand in a perfect arc, striking Morrison's rifle barrel and sending the weapon spinning from his grasp before Morrison could recover. Tashunka closed the distance between them with bounds that covered ground, like a hunting cat. The years fell away from his weathered frame as ancestral spirits flowed through him, providing strength and speed beyond ordinary human limits. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brief but decisive. Morrison had size and weight advantages, but Tashunka fought with techniques passed down through generations of Apache warriors. Every move connected him to ancestors who had perfected these methods. During centuries of survival against overwhelming odds, Morrison swung desperately with his fists, trying to use brute force to overcome his opponent's skill. But Tashunka flowed around the clumsy attacks like water around stones, striking pressure points his grandfather had taught him to find in darkness. Within moments, Morrison lay gasping on the ground, his expensive clothing torn and his confidence shattered completely. The blood-stained arrowhead pressed against his throat, held in hands that had learned their deadly precision from masters of Apache warfare. "Your men can leave," Tashunka said quietly, his voice carrying to the surviving hired guns who watched. "From cover, take your wounded and ride away. This conflict is between Morrison and me now." The remaining fighters needed no further encouragement. They had signed on to capture animals and arrest a rogue Apache, not to die defending a man who had lied about murder and involved them in federal crimes. Within minutes, they were mounted, heading toward the main trail, carrying their wounded companions and leaving Morrison to face the consequences of his choices alone. "You can't kill me," Morrison gasped, feeling the ancient weapon's edge against his skin. "I've got powerful friends, government connections. Kill me, and you'll have federal marshals hunting you for the rest of your life." Tashunka studied the man beneath him with eyes that seemed to look through flesh to the spirit within. "Your government friends will find it difficult to explain why they backed a man who murdered federal inspectors and trafficked in illegal wildlife. You got no proof of that. I have your letters, your documents, your own words witnessed by the men who just abandoned you. More importantly, I have the truth, and truth is power that your corruption cannot touch." Morrison's face went pale as he realized his situation had become truly hopeless. The evidence of his crimes lay scattered around the canyon, and his hired guns would certainly talk if questioned by honest federal authorities seeking to avenge Inspector Crawford's murder. But Tashunka had not fought this battle for revenge. Apache tradition taught that true warriors fought to protect the innocent, not to punish the guilty. Justice would come through proper channels, but his obligation was to ensure the cub's safety. "I could kill you," he said calmly, "but your death would not restore their mother or erase the fear you put in their hearts. Instead, you will live to face the consequences of your choices." He bound Morrison with the man's own rope, securing him to a sturdy tree where he could not escape but would survive until federal authorities arrived. The cub's hiding place remained secret, protected by sacred stones, and the warrior who had proven his commitment to their welfare died as evening approached. Tashunka heard a sound that made his heart leap, the distinctive cry of cubs calling for their protector. Little Warrior had led his siblings from their hiding place, somehow sensing that the danger had passed, and their guardian had emerged victorious. The three small cats approached him cautiously, their golden eyes reflecting trust earned through shared trials. They pressed against him for comfort, seeking reassurance that their world had returned to safety. Morrison watched this reunion with expressions that mixed defeat with grudging understanding. For the first time, he seemed to comprehend what he had been fighting against, not just one old Apache, but a bond that transcended species and connected all living things in webs of mutual obligation. The blood-stained arrowhead lay beside him, in the dust, its ancient power having served justice once again. Soon, federal investigators would arrive to sort through the evidence of corruption and murder. But for now, 3 orphan cubs had their protector, and sacred promises had been kept despite overwhelming odds. The war for innocent lives was finally over. 3 weeks after Morrison's defeat, federal investigators arrived to untangle the web of corruption that had reached from frontier hunting camps to eastern cities. Marshal Thompson, the same man Morrison had expected to provide official backing for his illegal operations, proved to be an honest officer horrified by the evidence of his colleague's murder and the commercial network built on wildlife trafficking. The letters and documents Tashunka had preserved told the complete story of Inspector Crawford's investigation and subsequent murder. Morrison's confession, extracted under pressure of facing federal prosecution for killing a government official, revealed the full scope of Western Wildlife Enterprises and its wealthy Eastern backers. Within days, arrests were made in New York and Boston. The exotic animal trafficking network collapsed as federal authorities seized assets and closed the illegal markets that had driven demand for creatures like the mountain lion cubs. Morrison himself faced trial for murder, conspiracy, and violation of territorial wildlife protection laws. Tashunka was officially cleared of all charges related to Crawford's disappearance. More importantly, he was recognized by territorial authorities as having performed a significant service by exposing the criminal conspiracy. The governor himself sent a letter commending his courage and dedication to justice, but such official recognition meant less to Tashunka than the more immediate concern of the cubs' welfare. They had grown stronger and more confident during the weeks of recovery, but they still showed the psychological effects of their captivity and trauma. Little Warrior had developed into a natural leader, but all 3 remained unnaturally dependent on human protection. Thought the decision about their future weighed heavily on Tashunka's mind. Apache tradition was clear about the relationship between humans and wild creatures. Each species belonged in its proper place, following the path the Creator had established. Mountain lions belonged in the high country, not in the company of humans, however well-intentioned. Yet releasing them too soon could condemn them to death from starvation or predation. They had missed crucial months of learning from their mother, and their hunting instincts remained underdeveloped. Freedom without the skills to survive was not true liberation, but merely a different form of cruelty. The solution came through patient teaching and careful observation. Each day, Tashunka took the cubs further into the wilderness, encouraging them to explore and experiment with natural behaviors. He brought them wounded prey animals that they could practice stalking and killing, gradually awakening instincts that captivity had suppressed. Little Warrior showed the quickest progress, his bold spirit translating into confidence in natural settings. His siblings followed his lead, learning through imitation and play the skills their mother would have taught them. By autumn, all three were successfully hunting small game and beginning to establish individual territories. The final test came when Tashunka decided they were ready for complete independence. On a crisp morning in late October, he led them to a high meadow where deer trails converged and water ran clean and cold. Here in country their mother had once claimed as her own, he would determine whether his promise had been truly fulfilled. From his medicine pouch, he withdrew 3 small bells crafted from silver, traded at the agency store. Each bell bore Apache symbols for protection and freedom, blessed through ceremonies that connected them to spiritual forces that watched over all wild creatures. The bells would allow him to track the cubs during their first weeks of independence, while marking them as under sacred protection. The freedom bells represented the completion of his sacred obligation. By placing them on the cubs, he formally acknowledged their transition from dependent charges to free creatures, capable of making their own choices about survival and territory. Little Warrior submitted to the bell placement with dignity that suggested he understood its significance. His siblings followed suit, trusting their brother's judgment about this new ritual. When all three wore their freedom markers, they looked like small spirits of the mountain, ready to reclaim their birthright. "Your mother died fighting for this moment," Tashunka told them softly, speaking the Apache words his grandmother had used for important ceremonies. "She gave her life so that you could live free in the places your ancestors knew. Honor her sacrifice by becoming what you were born to be." The cubs seemed to understand that a threshold was being crossed. They approached him one final time, accepting his touch and offering their own small gestures of affection. Then, following Little Warrior's lead, they turned toward the deep wilderness and began walking away from human protection toward their natural destiny. Tashunka watched them disappear into the forest with emotions that mixed joy and profound sadness. His promise was fulfilled, but its completion also meant separation from creatures who had become precious to him. They would face dangers in the wild that his protection could have prevented, but they would face them as free mountain lions rather than captive curiosities. Over the following months, he occasionally glimpsed them in the distance during his hunting expeditions. The bells allowed him to track their movements and confirm that all three had survived the transition to independence. Little Warrior had claimed territory near the place where their mother had died, as if honoring her memory through his choice of hunting grounds. By spring, the cubs had grown into young adults, sleek and powerful and fully capable of surviving without human assistance. The bells still adorned their necks, but they had learned to move silently despite their presence. More importantly, they had learned to avoid human contact, while maintaining their connection to the guardian who had kept his sacred promise. The territorial government established a protected wildlife area, encompassing the canyon where their mother had died and the high country where her cubs now hunted. Federal funding supported ongoing patrols to prevent future illegal hunting operations, and severe penalties were established for anyone attempting to trap or kill protected predators. Years later, Tashunka would sometimes see new cubs playing in the meadows where he had taught their parents to hunt. The bloodline continued, free and wild as it was meant to be. The freedom bells had been passed down through generations, marking each new litter as descendants of the 3 small lives one Apache warrior had chosen to protect. On quiet evenings, as he sat outside his dwelling watching shadows lengthen across the canyon walls, Tashunka would hear those bells ringing faintly in the distance. The sound carried more than mere location. It announced that promises kept with honor created legacies that outlasted individual lives, that the three cubs he had sworn to protect had become the foundation of a thriving mountain lion population that would inhabit these protected lands for generations to come. His grandfather's teachings about the connection between all living things had proven true in ways even the old warrior could not have anticipated. Sometimes the most important victories were measured not in enemies defeated, but in innocent lives allowed to flourish according to their true nature. The bells would ring in these mountains long after Tashunka's own spirit had joined his ancestors. But their music would always carry the echo of a promise kept against impossible odds.